Hey guys, tonight we begin with something brutal. Not swords and sandals Hollywood brutality, but real historical nightmare fuel. A time when entire cities vanished without a trace. When survival didn't depend on strength, wealth, or faith, but pure luck. When one man's empire built on horseback and arrows steamrolled through civilizations like a wildfire across dry grass. This is not the story of noble knights or valiant heroes. This is about ordinary people. Shopkeepers, scribes, farmers, kids, people who just happened to be in the wrong place when the sky darkened with arrows and the earth trembled beneath hooves. Tonight, we're diving into what it was really like to live through the Mongol invasions. And let's be clear, sucked is putting it lightly. If you were alive in their path, you weren't just in danger, you were already halfway gone. So get comfortable, or as comfortable as you can, while imagining mass executions, rivers turning red, and libraries set ablaze. Dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and try not to think too hard about what it would feel like to watch your whole world end in a single afternoon. Now let's start with something quiet. Something terrifying. Something final. Imagine you live in a bustling city, traders shouting in the marketplace. Kids chasing dogs through alleyways. The scent of fresh bread mixed with charcoal smoke in the air. Life isn't perfect, but it's yours. And then one morning, the ground starts shaking, not from an earthquake, but from something worse. Hooves. Thousands of them. Riders crest the hill boughs already drawn. You've just met the Mongols. By nightfall, your city is silent. Buildings still smoldering. Rivers clogged with bodies. The only sound now the cause of circling birds. This wasn't a battle. This was deletion, and it wasn't rare. This is exactly what happened to places like Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Urgench. Ancient cities that had thrived for centuries, wiped out in hours or days. Merv alone may have lost 700,000 people. The scale is still debated, but even the lowest estimates are sickening. These weren't just killings. These were erasures. Every man, woman, and child. Gone. The Mongols weren't trying to take over these cities in the traditional sense. They weren't looking to rule a population or collect taxes from them. They were sending a message. Submit or become a story that mothers whisper to scare their children. And those stories spread like fire. Witnesses fled, if they survived, and told of unimaginable horrors. Pyramids made from severed heads, streets so slick with blood horses tripped while running, babies thrown into flames. Was it all true? Some of it, no doubt, was exaggerated by terrified refugees. But a lot of it wasn't. The Mongols wanted you to hear these stories. They were part of the plan, because fear wasn't just a side effect of Mongol warfare. It was the first wave of every attack. And the moment your city heard what happened to the last one, the damage had already begun. But who were these people? What kind of society produces an army like that? So disciplined, so ruthless, so unstoppable? To understand why it sucked to be alive during the Mongol invasions, you first have to meet the horde. Asterisk, they smelled like horse sweat, leather, and dried mutton. Their clothes were patched hides. Their armor was light but lethal. Their saddles were stained with years of blood and travel. They weren't tall, but they rode tall. And when you saw them coming, it was already too late. The Mongol horde wasn't just a bunch of savages galloping in from the steppe. They were a machine refined, calculated, terrifying in their precision. But to understand why they were so feared, you have to understand where they came from. Steppe life was brutal. If you didn't learn to ride by age 4, you probably didn't make it to 10. If your horse got sick, your family starved. If the weather turned, your tent blew away, and wolves took the rest. In this kind of world, only the tough survived. And the Mongols weren't just tough, They were born ready. From a young age, boys were trained in archery, herding, endurance, riding, and survival. They learned to sleep on their saddles, drink blood from their horses in emergencies, and move as one with their mount. Their composite bows could pierce armor at full gallop. They didn't need roads. They didn't need supply lines. They were the supply line. And at the center of all this was a man named Temujin. History remembers him as Genghis Khan. Temujin wasn't born powerful. He clawed his way up from nothing, betrayed, exiled, hunted, but he outlasted everyone. He united warring tribes not by charm, but by force, loyalty, and fear. If you didn't join him, you were crushed. If you betrayed him, you were erased. And once he had the steppe under his control, he looked outward. The army he built wasn't just enormous, it was efficient. Mongol units were organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with clear command structure and ruthless discipline. They could break apart and reform like water. One division might feint retreat, luring enemies into a trap. Another could travel hundreds of miles in just a few days, coordinating attacks from multiple directions, like thunder that struck in all directions at once. And they weren't just brute force. They employed engineers from conquered cities, adapted siege technology from the Chinese, and built networks of scouts and spies. They learned from every battle, which meant each invasion only got deadlier. But the scariest part? They kept coming. The horde wasn't just a one-time invasion. It was a wave that rolled over the map again and again. If you survived the first attack, congratulations. They'd be back with new plans, new weapons, and no mercy. Many people today imagine Mongols as a chaotic swarm, but they weren't. They were surgeons of destruction, focused, organized, deliberate. And their loyalty to Genghis Khan bordered on religious. He told them they had a divine mission to unite the world under his rule. And the people who stood in the way? Just obstacles to be cleared. But it wasn't just the Mongol speed and skill that made them so deadly. They had one more weapon that cities couldn't defend against. One that doesn't shoot arrows or swing swords. When you think of warfare, you might picture clashing swords, fire-lit sieges, arrows whistling overhead. But the Mongols figured out something far more effective: fear. And not just fear as a byproduct of violence. No, this was strategic, industrial grade. Terror, crafted, calculated, delivered with intent. Picture this. You're the ruler of a fortified city. Word arrives that a distant town much larger than yours was wiped off the map. Not conquered, not looted, wiped out. Every single inhabitant slaughtered. Their heads piled into pyramids. Their leaders tied to horses and torn apart limb by limb. Their temples burned, their rivers turned red, their libraries thrown into the flames. That message didn't come from rumors. It came from the Mongols themselves, carried on purpose. Survivors were spared not out of mercy, but so they could run and tell the next city what was coming. The Mongols had mastered the psychology of war. They knew that sometimes you didn't need to fight if your enemy broke before you even arrived. And it worked time and time again. Cities surrendered without a fight. Gates opened in exchange for promises of mercy. But here's the twist. Sometimes they kept their word. A city that surrendered might be spared, its people left alive, its leaders stripped of power but allowed to live. But other times, even surrender wasn't enough. The Mongols would smile, "Thank you for your cooperation," then kill everyone anyway. Why? Because unpredictability was part of the strategy. If cities never knew whether surrender would save them or doom them, panic spread faster than reason. It created chaos, desperation, paranoia. Some cities surrendered, preemptively, fearing annihilation. Others resisted harder, assuming death was certain either way. Either outcome benefited the horde. There's a story of a Mongol commander who captured a city and asked where the nobility was hiding. When they refused to answer, he executed every 10th man until someone spoke. Then, once he found the nobles, he executed them all too. Another tactic? Releasing prisoners with mutilated bodies, hands cut off, eyes gouged out, sent back to their homelands as living warnings. Imagine seeing your cousin stumble home like that. Would you stand and fight? And then there was the infamous move of using human shields. The Mongols would drive refugees, women, children, old men, ahead of their army during sieges, forcing defenders to either shoot their own people or let the Mongols get close enough to break the walls. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was terror as a weapon. And it didn't stop at the gates. Mongol scouts were trained to infiltrate ahead of time-spread rumors, fake attacks, set fires. They'd poison wells, kill livestock, or release captives in enemy territory just to watch the chaos unfold. Terror even reached into nature. In battle, Mongol soldiers used noise tactics, drums, horns, animal skins flapping in the wind to make the numbers seem even greater. It worked. More than once, defenders fled their posts after hearing what sounded like an army of hundreds, of thousands, when in fact it was only a few thousand deployed with genius precision. But terror wasn't just for outsiders. Inside the Mongol ranks, discipline was brutal. Cowardice was punished by death. Disobedience? Death. Retreat without permission? Death. This internal terror kept their machine running without error. No soldier wanted to be the reason Genghis Khan got angry. Now imagine being on the receiving end of this. You're not a soldier. You're a baker, or a stonemason, or a mother of 3. And you hear they're coming. You've seen what happens. When they do you run? Fight? Hide? Pray? You don't know. And that uncertainty, that psychological torment, is exactly how the Mongols won battles before they even arrived. But for the cities that did decide to resist, that led to something even more horrifying. A wall of skulls and a river of blood. They say Merv was the shining pearl of Khorasan, a city so rich in culture, trade, and architecture it was considered one of the wonders of its time, until the Mongols showed up. Then it became a graveyard. The story goes like this. Merv surrendered, gave up without a fight, opened its gates and begged for mercy. In response, the Mongols separated the population into groups: men, women, children, scholars, artisans, merchants. Then they methodically executed them, not in a frenzy of chaos, but in shifts. Groups of prisoners led out in batches, beheaded, buried, replaced by the next group, again and again and again. Reports say it took several days, and by the time it was over, the city was gone, not just physically, but emotionally. The Mongols weren't interested in taking over the city. They wanted to make an example of it. A lesson for the next place. That lesson? Resistance or surrender didn't guarantee anything. And above all, don't test the horde. In the city of Nishapur, the killing reached levels that even horrified some Mongols. Legend has it that after the death of a Mongol commander's son struck, down by a Nishapuri arrow his widow demanded revenge. The result? Some say 90,000 dead. Others say 150,000. Whatever the number, the outcome was clear. No mercy, no survivors, not even pets. And then there was Urgench. That one didn't go quietly. The defenders resisted fiercely, fighting back wave after wave. The siege dragged on for months. When the city finally fell, the Mongols were so enraged by the delay that they let their wrath run unchecked. Streets were clogged with corpses, wells choked with blood. Estimates say hundreds of thousands were executed, many of them civilians. In every case, the aftermath was almost ritualistic. Skulls stacked in pyramids, towers built of bones, messages etched in blood on broken city gates. This is what happens when you defy us. They didn't just destroy cities, they unbuilt them. Libraries burned, temples razed, irrigation. Systems some thousands of years old smashed beyond repair. Crops torched, fields salted, trade routes abandoned. It wasn't just conquest. It was scorched earth annihilation. Like someone had dragged a blade across the map and erased everything in its path. But why such rage? Why such complete destruction? Some historians argue it was practical. With fewer people, there was less chance of rebellion, less need for garrisons, fewer mouths to feed, and more psychological damage to future enemies. But others point to something darker. This was how the Mongols waged war. They believed the world had to be cleansed before it could be remade under Mongol order. And for those left alive, they didn't fare much better. Survivors were enslaved, women taken, children scattered. Some were used as human shields in the next siege. Others were forced to work in Mongol war camps, digging trenches, collecting arrows, building siege engines. And always under watch, always with the memory of what had just happened fresh in their minds. And that's the real power of Mongol violence. It didn't end when the killing stopped. The horror lingered. It echoed down generations. Whole regions entered periods of cultural silence. No music, no literature, no rebuilding. Just trauma. But what allowed the Mongols to do this on such a massive scale wasn't just bloodlust. It was speed. Brutal, relentless, logistical speed. And that speed broke empires like twigs. Try to picture this. You're a king, a powerful one. You have walls, soldiers, alliances, scouts posted at your borders. You hear rumors of strange horsemen out east, but your city is hundreds of miles away. You figure you've got time. Weeks, maybe months. Then, one morning, a scout stumbles in through the gates. His clothes are torn, eyes wide, face pale. He says the Mongols are coming. And not just coming, they're already here. The speed of the Mongol military machine didn't make sense to people back then. It barely makes sense now. In an era when most armies traveled as slowly as their carts and foot soldiers would allow, the Mongols moved like smoke. Sometimes 1,000 kilometers in a week. They crossed mountains, deserts, rivers terrain that would stop ordinary armies cold. They didn't just outrun their enemies. They outpaced news of their own attacks. By the time one city heard of a siege, the Mongols were already sacking the next one. But it wasn't magic. It was planning. Ruthless, brilliant planning. First, horses. Each Mongol warrior didn't ride one horse. He rode 5. They'd rotate between them, keeping each one fresh. When a horse tired, they'd swap. The result? Riders that could move 80 to 100 miles per day, every day. Multiply that by tens of thousands of warriors. And suddenly, no empire was safe. Second, they carried little baggage. Mongols lived off the land. Dried meat, fermented milk, even drinking their horses' blood in emergencies. No need for long supply lines. No waiting for food wagons to catch up. They were the supply train. Third, communication. Mongol courier stations, called yam, stretched across their territory like arteries. Riders could deliver messages with terrifying efficiency. A general hundreds of miles away could still coordinate an assault with perfect timing. This is what allowed them to pull off moves no one else could. They'd fake a retreat, disappear into the hills, and return from another direction days later, striking a completely different city, or split their forces into separate columns, each one capable of fighting independently, and converge on a target like a closing fist. One story tells of Mongol forces invading Poland and Hungary at the same time, hundreds of miles apart, winning both battles within days. The kings never saw it coming. Another tale comes from Khwarezmia, after a disastrous betrayal of a Mongol trade caravan. Genghis Khan responded not with a diplomatic envoy, but with multiple armies that crossed deserts and mountain passes in winter, surrounding the empire from 3 sides. Cities fell in rapid succession. Within 2 years, an empire that had taken generations to build ceased to exist. And here's the part that messes with your head. They kept maps, studied geography, scouted terrain months in advance, even long before an attack. Mongol agents were gathering intel, noting water sources, supply depots, hidden passes. Their knowledge of enemy territory often surpassed that of the people living in it. This wasn't random conquest. It was GPS-guided destruction 7 centuries before satellites. And it didn't just break armies. It broke governments. By the time rulers realized what was happening, their outposts were gone, their messengers intercepted, their allies crushed. Bureaucracies collapsed. Panic spread. Refugees flooded the countryside. Orders stopped coming. Soldiers deserted. Cities locked their gates and prayed. And once fear began doing the Mongols' work for them, they picked up even more speed. Sometimes the terror alone outran the horde. And when it didn't, when a city decided to stand its ground, well, let's just say, no one was off limits. There were no safe zones. Not monasteries, not markets, not orphanages. The Mongols made no distinction between warrior and civilian, sacred and profane, young or old. Once a city was marked for destruction, or even conquest, the idea of sparing non-combatants simply didn't enter the picture. Women were not spared. Many were taken, either forced into the camps as concubines, or distributed among soldiers as gifts. Others were simply executed, along with the men. Some were reportedly buried alive. Some, according to sources, were rounded up, stripped of valuables, and then systematically eliminated. And the worst part? These weren't outliers. This was the policy. Children? Same story. They could grow up to be rebels. So they weren't given the chance. There are tales of entire nurseries slaughtered to the last cradle. Skeptics might argue that such accounts are exaggerated, that numbers were inflated by terrified chroniclers. But when multiple cities across different regions tell the same kinds of stories, backed by archaeological finds of mass, graves filled with small bones, it stops sounding like legend and starts looking like policy. Animals weren't spared either. Livestock was often stolen, but if it slowed down the army, killed. Dogs, cats, birds even, they weren't safe in some cities. After all, animals can make noise, reveal hiding places, serve as food for enemies. Better to remove them too. And what about religion? The Mongols didn't hate gods. In fact, they were surprisingly open-minded when it came to faith. They employed Buddhist advisors, married Christian queens, and occasionally sponsored Islamic scholars. But this tolerance didn't mean mercy. Mosques, temples, churches, they all burned if they stood in the way. In Baghdad, the house of wisdom and dawn, ancient library filled with centuries of knowledge was reportedly thrown into the Tigris River. According to legend, the books bled ink so thick the waters ran black for days. Monks and priests were sometimes spared for their skills writing, healing, languages, but just as often, they were silenced alongside their flocks. Entire religious orders disappeared, sacred texts burned, holy sites turned into barracks or rubble. Even the very old weren't exempt. Some elderly were used as examples, paraded before the people before being executed. Others were killed outright, their experience and wisdom lost forever in a single moment. And let's talk about the scholars. The Mongols had an odd relationship with knowledge. They respected useful knowledge maps, siege engineering, medicine. But poetry, philosophy, astronomy, often seen as luxuries of soft men. And soft men had no place in Genghis Khan's world. So when a city fell, its scholars were sifted. The useful ones were captured, the rest forgotten. Sometimes they were hunted down, first killed, to prevent any organized cultural memory from rebuilding. One historian called the Mongol Invasions a war on memory, because it wasn't just the people who vanished. It was everything they knew, the names of their streets, the designs of their homes, the music they played, gone. And while this horror descended on city after city, those who survived it knew the truth. It didn't matter who you were. You could be a child, a nun, a farmer, a poet. If the Mongols were coming, you were in the same category as everyone else. Target. But before the arrows flew and the swords fell, something strange often happened first. A whisper, a disappearance, a sudden fire, a rumor from inside the city walls. Because the first soldiers of the Mongol horde weren't cavalry. They were spies. Before the thunder of hooves, before the sky went dark with arrows, the Mongols were already there, not with armies, but with whispers. One of the most terrifying realities of a Mongol invasion was this. By the time you realized you were under attack, it was already too late. Because while their cavalry was still weeks away, their intelligence had already infiltrated your city. Spies, scouts, merchants, even monks. And they weren't just watching. They were preparing. It started with information. Maps of your walls, the layout of your streets, who held power, where the grain stores were, where the guards slept, which gates were weakest. Mongol agents gathered all of it quietly, slowly, invisibly. Sometimes they posed as traders, sometimes travelers, sometimes just hired scribes or translators. And they didn't need to escape with the intel, because many of them had been living in your city for years. Some were planted long before the Mongols even considered attacking your region. Others were recruited from within, disgruntled citizens, rival ethnic groups, outcasts. The horde had a knack for turning internal tensions into opportunities. Once the groundwork was laid, the second wave began. Sabotage. Fires set in key granaries. Wells poisoned. Bridges collapsed overnight. Morale-shattering rumors spread through marketplaces. The army at the border just fell. The governors fled. Your neighbor is a spy. People turned on each other before a single arrow flew. Some cities even crumbled from the inside, their leadership paralyzed by paranoia. Offenders locking gates against their own citizens. Panic-driven decisions. Revolts. Some governors were assassinated by their own people, hoping it would buy mercy from the approaching horde. It didn't. And then there was the psychological warfare of surrender negotiations. The Mongols didn't always demand tribute with armies. Sometimes they sent envoys first. Calm, polite, even generous. Join us. Pay tribute. We'll protect you. You'll keep your leaders, your religion, your customs. And sometimes it was true if you stayed loyal. But there was always an undertone, a shadow behind the smile, because everyone knew what happened to cities that betrayed Mongol trust. Remember Khwarezm? Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic caravan to its Shah, a peaceful mission meant to open trade. But the Shah, suspicious and arrogant, had the envoys executed. He didn't realize it then, but he had just signed his civilization's death warrant. The Mongols unleashed a revenge campaign so complete that even salt was left behind. From that point on, trust came with a knife edge. And yet, some rulers still chose to surrender, because for a few, it worked. Cities like Kaifeng and Novgorod submitted early, paid tribute, and were left largely intact. Some even gained favor becoming Mongol client states, complete with trade benefits and political leverage. But the catch? You were now part of the machine. Your taxes fueled more invasions. Your soldiers fought in Mongol campaigns. Your loyalty had to be absolute. One act of defiance, real or imagined, and your entire city could be wiped out. Surrender wasn't. Survival. It was gambling with your identity, your people, and your future. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Because soon the Mongols would reach the beating heart of the Islamic world. A place no one thought could fall. A city of scholars, artists, and poets. Baghdad. And what happened there would shock the world. Asterisk. In the year 1258, Baghdad was more than just a city. It was the cultural and intellectual capital of the Islamic world. A beacon of knowledge, science, and philosophy. Home to poets and astronomers, doctors and mathematicians. Libraries filled with thousands of rare texts, some dating back to the Greeks. The House of Wisdom was here, where scholars had preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of ancient civilizations. And then the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, led the campaign. He marched west with a clear goal: destroy the Abbasid Caliphate. Make no mistake, this wasn't a raid. It was a mission of annihilation. At first, the Caliph, al-Mustasim, refused to believe the rumors. Baghdad had withstood threats before. It was protected by mighty walls, a swollen population, and centuries of prestige. Who would dare attack Baghdad? That doubt sealed the city's fate. The Mongols surrounded Baghdad and began a siege in January. They brought engineers, siege towers, battering rams, some supplied by Chinese experts in their ranks. The Tigris River, which once symbolized life, was turned into a moat of death. The siege lasted less than 2 weeks. By mid-February, the walls were breached, and what followed was one of the most brutal sackings in human history. The Mongols did not discriminate. They stormed through homes, mosques, hospitals, schools. Anyone in their path was cut down. Men, women, children, slaves, nobles, no one was spared. Even animals were slaughtered en masse. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries the world had ever known, was destroyed. According to some accounts, the Mongols threw so many books into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink. Other witnesses claimed the river also ran red from blood. Whether those accounts are symbolic or literal doesn't matter. The point is, Baghdad didn't just fall, it was erased. The Caliph himself? Captured. Some sources say he was rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses, executed without shedding royal blood, in accordance with Mongol superstition. Others say he was starved. However it happened, one of the most powerful rulers in the Muslim world was removed like a footnote. By the time the Mongols left, nearly 200,000 people were dead. Some estimates go even higher. Whole neighborhoods were burned to the ground. The infrastructure of an entire civilization was dismantled in a matter of days. And Baghdad never truly recovered. The city that had once symbolized the heights of Islamic Golden Age was reduced to a husk. Its scholars dead, its books gone, its people scattered. For centuries afterward, the Islamic world would feel the echo of that loss. But here's what's worse. This wasn't even the beginning. It was the middle of a storm. Because as Baghdad burned, other cities were next. Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, they all braced for impact. And even Europe began to tremble. Because now, the horde was turning west. And nothing, not mountains, not rivers, not kingdoms, would slow them down. After Baghdad fell, a message rolled westward across the continent, spoken by survivors, whispered by merchants, scribbled in the margins of letters carried on horseback. They're coming. In Asia, the devastation was already in full swing. From the Chinese plains to the Iranian plateau, Entire cultures had been flattened. Merv, Herat, Samarkand, Nishapur legendary cities, with walls older than most European dynasties, were now graveyards. Kingdoms had ceased to exist. Trade routes were no longer bustling highways, but skeletal trails of ash and ruins. But for Europe, the Mongols were still rumors, shadows behind the mountains, horror stories told by trembling merchants and fleeing refugees. Until they weren't. In the 1240s, the Mongols made their entrance into Eastern Europe. The Golden Horde, under Bada Khan, another grandson of Genghis, poured into the steppes of Russia, Poland, and Hungary. And just like before, they didn't knock. In 1240, Kiev, once the shining capital of Kiev and Rus, fell. The sack was apocalyptic. Churches looted, monks slaughtered, entire districts flattened. Survivors wrote of streets so full of corpses that one couldn't walk without stepping on them. Kiev had stood for over 300 years. It fell in just a few days. Then came Poland. In 1241, the Mongols split into multiple forces and struck with lightning speed. At the Battle of Legnica, Polish forces under Duke Henry, II of Silesia, tried to resist. They even had knights from military orders, like the Teutonic Knights. It didn't matter. Mongol tactics tore through them. Henry was decapitated, his head mounted on a spear and paraded before the ruins of his army. At the same time, Hungary was hit. The Battle of Mohi was even worse. King Bela IV had assembled a massive army, but the Mongols used feigned retreats, river traps, and fire arrows to box the Hungarians in and wipe them out. Tens of thousands died. Hungarian resistance collapsed. Towns burned. People fled into forests, swamps, and mountains. Western Europe was in a panic. Letters from the Pope described the Mongols as a scourge from God. Monks interpreted their arrival as the apocalypse. Prophets declared them the lost tribes of Israel, or demons sent to punish Christian sins. The Catholic Church began organizing. Crusade-like defenses. Castles were reinforced. Walls rebuilt. Royal courts abandoned comfort for strategy sessions. Kings actually started talking to each other, a rare thing in an era defined by petty squabbles. And then the Mongols stopped. Just as they reached the doorstep of Austria and Germany, word came from the east. The great Khan Gide had died. Beta and his commanders turned around. They had to return to Mongolia to participate in the succession crisis. And just like that, the Mongol wave receded from Europe's edge. It was a miracle, a lucky break, one that Europe barely understood. And instead of using the reprieve to prepare, most kingdoms breathed a sigh of relief and went back to their wars and court intrigue. But they should have known better, because the Mongols hadn't forgotten Europe. They were just taking a breath, and they were about to help unleash something far more deadly than even their arrows, the Black Death. It wasn't just blood that the Mongols spread. It was something smaller, something invisible, something that would kill more people than all the swords and arrows in the world ever could. It started near the Black Sea. The year was 1346, and the Mongols were laying siege to a Genoese trading outpost in Crimea called Kaffa. Like they had done countless times before, the Mongols surrounded the city, cut off its supplies, and prepared to starve it into surrender. But then, something strange began happening. Mongol soldiers started dropping dead. Not from wounds, but from something else. Something far more horrifying. They were dying fast, in agony. Buboes swelling under their skin, flesh turning black. And the Mongols, ever resourceful, decided to turn it into a weapon. According to one account, they catapulted the bodies of their plague victims over the walls of Kaffa. Imagine that. You're standing on the ramparts, keeping watch, and suddenly a bloated corpse comes sailing through the sky and lands with a wet thump in the courtyard. And another. And another. It was one of the earliest examples of biological warfare in recorded history. Now, whether that's exactly how the plague entered Europe is still debated by historians. But what's certain is this: Mongol expansion and trade networks created highways for the disease. The Pax Mongolica, the so-called Mongol Peace, linked east and west like never before. Goods flowed. Caravans moved freely. So did rats and fleas and the bacterium Yersinia pestis. From the Silk Road to the ports of the Mediterranean, the disease hitched a ride. By 1347, it had arrived in Sicily. Then the Italian mainland, France, England, Germany. It spread faster than anyone could understand. Within a few short years, it wiped out somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Cities emptied, villages vanished. Entire families died in a matter of days. And while the Mongols didn't create the plague, they accelerated it. Their warpaths destabilized entire regions. Survivors fled with the disease clinging to their clothes. Refugees carried it across borders. Their trade routes became disease superhighways. And with no understanding of infection, no knowledge of germs, no concept of quarantine, medieval people did the only thing they could: run, pray, and bury the dead, which wasn't easy when there were so many bodies. In some towns, carts were filled with corpses and wheeled out daily. In others, gravediggers refused to work for any price. Monks died mid-prayer. Entire monasteries were emptied. In cities like Florence, the death toll was so high that officials burned bodies in mass funeral pyres outside the walls. The fear was almost as contagious as the plague itself. Some believed it was God's punishment. Others blamed minorities. Pogroms broke out. Whole communities were lynched, drowned, or burned based on rumor alone. Social order collapsed. Nobles fled their manors. Peasants abandoned fields. Priests refused last rites. Doctors gave up. And while all of this was happening, while Europe screamed and rotted, the Mongol world kept moving. Not untouched by the plague, but still grinding forward, still invading, still demanding tribute, still pulling strings from across the steppes. And that's what made the terror worse, because there was no escaping it. Either the Mongols came and your city burned, or they didn't, and you died coughing up blood in a ditch. But what about those who did resist? Who decided to make a stand, draw swords, and defy the horde? They didn't last long, but their stories? They still echo today. Imagine being told that the most powerful army the world had ever seen was coming and deciding to fight anyway. Some cities did. Some kingdoms did. They looked at the Mongols, heard the stories, saw the smoke on the horizon, and still said no. And almost all of them were annihilated. Let's start with the Khwarezmian Empire. On paper, it was strong, vast territory, large army, wealthy cities. But when Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan as a diplomatic gesture, the Shah had the merchants arrested and executed. Bad move. Genghis took it personally. The result wasn't just war. It was obliteration. In a matter of 2 years, the entire Khwarezmian Empire was reduced to rubble. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench were burned. Millions, yes, millions were likely dead. Survivors fled into the desert. The Shah died a broken man, reportedly alone, sick and hunted. Other rulers learned nothing from that example. In Eastern Europe, King Bela IV of Hungary decided to defy the Mongols after they demanded submission. He built up his defenses, called in reinforcements, and made bold speeches. But at the Battle of Mohi, his forces were trapped and slaughtered. The Mongols had studied the river crossings, planned the ambushes, and collapsed the Hungarian army. like a tent in a windstorm. Bela fled. His people didn't. Whole Hungarian villages were emptied. Towns leveled. Tens of thousands perished. Hungary entered a period of devastation, so deep it took decades to recover. Then there were the Alans and Cumans tribal peoples of the steppe, who tried to resist with cavalry of their own. But the Mongols outmaneuvered them. Worse, the Mongols turned their allies against them. The Cumans were betrayed, their leaders killed, and their warriors either executed or forced to fight for the Mongols under duress. In China, the Song dynasty held out for decades. They built fortresses, dug trenches, and tried to modernize their military. But even their advanced defenses and vast wealth couldn't save them. The Mongols adapted. They recruited Muslim engineers, built catapults that could launch 200-pound stones, used early forms of gunpowder bombs. The siege of Shenyang lasted years, but once it fell, so did the rest of southern China. The final Song emperor was a boy, just a child. As the Mongols closed in, his advisors placed him on a ship to escape, but the fleet was cornered. In a last act of loyalty, his guardian picked him up and leapt into the sea. The child emperor drowned, ending the dynasty. It wasn't just monarchs who tried to resist. Some cities took matters into their own hands. They barred gates, raised militias, refused tribute. But even when the defenders fought bravely, it usually ended the same way. Massacres, ruin, ash. Because resisting the Mongols wasn't like resisting a normal army. They didn't just defeat you. They punished you for trying. To resist was to bring down a storm on your people, a storm of fire and bone, of deception and steel. And that's what made them different from other conquerors. Most armies wanted control. The Mongols wanted compliance. If you resisted, you weren't just a problem. You were an example. And those who were spared began to wonder, was there a purpose to all this destruction? Or was it just chaos riding a horse? To find that answer, you have to look at the man behind it all. Not just the conqueror, but the believer. What Genghis Khan really wanted. It's easy to picture Genghis Khan as a pure force of destruction, a barbarian on horseback, hungry for land and blood. But that image misses something crucial, because behind the carnage was a man with a mission, a vision, a belief. He didn't think he was destroying the world. He thought he was fixing it. Genghis Khan-born Temujin had clawed his way up from nothing. He was born into a miner clan on the harsh Mongolian steppe. His father was poisoned, his family abandoned. He spent part of his youth scavenging for food. By all rights, he should have died forgotten in the wilderness, but he didn't. Instead, he united the tribes, not just through war, but through order. Loyalty to him replaced ancient blood feuds. He outlawed kidnapping women between tribes. He created a legal code, the Yasa, that punished theft, murder, betrayal. Under his rule, the law came first. Even high-ranking generals could be executed for stepping out of line. He believed the world was chaotic, and he was there to tame it. To Genghis, civilization wasn't defined by temples or cities or silk. Robes. It was discipline, unity, obedience. And he thought it was his destiny to impose it on a world that had none. He didn't just wage war. He rewired the places he conquered. Under Mongol rule, religious tolerance was official policy. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others were allowed to worship freely, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble. Merchants were protected, trade routes expanded, and crimes against traders were punished harshly. Bandits were crushed, corrupt officials executed. In many ways, the Silk Road had never been safer. And justice? It came fast. If a Mongol soldier mistreated a local peasant, he could be tried and executed. If a merchant was robbed, The local administrator was held responsible. Genghis Khan wanted stability, not just for his own people, but for the empire as a whole. He even tried diplomacy before war. He sent letters to rulers, offering alliances and trade. His invasions often started with negotiations. Submission was always an option. War was the punishment for saying no. But here's where it gets darker. Because his vision of order required cleansing the world of disorder. And disorder often meant entire cities, entire cultures. If you were weak, divided, or disrespectful, he considered your destruction justified. He didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as medicine. Rotten branches had to be cut so the tree could grow strong. And those cut branches, millions of lives. He once said, "It is not sufficient that I succeed. All others must fail." That wasn't just ego. That was policy. He didn't believe in coexisting with rivals. He believed in removing them completely. Even his spiritual beliefs supported this. The Mongols believed in Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a vast, all-seeing force. Genghis believed that Tengri had given him a divine mandate to unite the world under one rule, his rule. So conquest wasn't just ambition, it was holy work. That made him more dangerous than any ordinary warlord, because he wasn't just after land, he was after transformation. He burned libraries, but built postal roads. He toppled thrones, but spared engineers. He silenced poets, but enforced property rights. He was chaos, wearing the mask of law. And even after his death, his dream lived on. His children, his generals, his grandsons each carried the mission forward. They weren't just looting. They were reshaping the world in his image. But for the people caught in the middle, it didn't feel like divine order. It felt like surviving a wildfire. And for those who did survive, a new nightmare awaited. Life under Mongol rule. If you survived the invasion, if you hadn't been burned out of your home, trampled by cavalry, or buried in a ditch, life didn't go back to normal. It shifted into something new. Something quieter, colder, stripped bare. Living under Mongol rule wasn't just about following new laws. It was about existing inside someone else's system. One designed for efficiency, not comfort. Order, not culture. Control, not community. First came the census. The Mongols needed to know exactly who they were ruling. Scribes went door to door, listing every household, every man, woman, child, ox, goat, and acre of land. These weren't just lists. They were blueprints for taxation, conscription, and surveillance. Next came the taxes, and they were brutal. You paid in grain, wool, silk, silver, whatever your region produced. If you didn't pay, your possessions were seized. If you still couldn't pay, you or your children might be taken as laborers, or worse. And Mongol tax collectors didn't negotiate, they enforced. Some communities were split apart, forcibly relocated across the empire to fill economic gaps. Craftsmen were especially targeted. If you were good at something, blacksmithing, weaving, glass blowing, you could be uprooted from Persia and sent to work in China, or vice versa. You didn't get a say. You were a human resource, and yet there was order. Trade flourished in ways no one had ever seen. Roads that were once dangerous became safe because the Mongols executed bandits on sight. Markets expanded. Goods traveled from Korea to Damascus, from Baghdad to Venice. Paper money was introduced in many places, backed by the state. Merchants were given official passes called pesa that guaranteed their safety and access to Mongol inns and stables. The result? Economic integration on a scale the medieval world had never known. But it came at a price. Language barriers broke communities. Nomadic overseers misunderstood farming cycles, leading to famines. Mongol governors, often foreign to the areas they ruled, had no stake in local culture. They didn't care about old traditions, local holidays, or neighborhood elders. And they answered only to the Khan. Religious tolerance existed with conditions. You could pray however you wanted, as long as it didn't interfere with taxes, military service, or law. Step out of line, and no sanctuary would protect you. Temples, churches, and mosques could still be taxed. Priests could still be drafted. Saints didn't scare Mongols. There were bright spots, yes. Medicine improved in some areas. Papermaking spread westward. Astronomy, cartography, and mathematics moved across borders. But most of these advancements benefited the elite. The everyday peasants still lived under the same risks: starvation, violence, and silence. And always the fear. The Mongols didn't tolerate rebellion. Ever. Whispers of dissent were enough to bring a return visit. And those visits didn't come with warnings. Villages suspected of sheltering fugitives were erased. Towns that fell behind on quotas were punished. Sometimes entire districts were purged for a single crime. And unlike previous empires, the Mongols didn't integrate conquered peoples into their elite. They kept themselves separate. Their soldiers, their nobility, their courts, they remained Mongol. You could serve them, but you would never be them. So what was it like? Imagine living with a knife over your head. You can walk, talk, trade, worship, but always under the blade. You can farm your land, but it's not your land. Your children grow up speaking two languages. Your customs fade. Your stories stop being told. Because every time you remember who you were, you risk reminding them why they conquered you in the first place. And if that sounds bleak, just wait until the tribute system arrives. Under Mongol rule, money wasn't just money, it was survival. If your village, city, or kingdom wanted peace, you had to pay for it. In silver, in grain, in horses, in labor, in absolute submission. This was the tribute system. It wasn't new. Many empires had used it before Rome, Persia, China. But the Mongols perfected it, refined it into a cold, unstoppable mechanism. A bloodless invasion that kept the swords sharp just in case. Here's how it worked. A Mongol envoy would ride into your city unarmed, smiling. He'd carry a message, sometimes poetic, sometimes terrifying in its simplicity. The Great Khan requires your loyalty. Submit, and all will be well. Refuse, and we return with fire. If your leaders were wise or afraid, they submitted. That meant kneeling before a Mongol representative, offering symbolic gifts, and signing treaties. More importantly, it meant promising to pay a yearly tribute. Failure to do so even once meant destruction. But tribute wasn't a flat fee. It was calculated, adjusted, squeezed. Sometimes it was gold, sometimes soldiers. Sometimes your sons, taken away to serve in far-off wars, or as hostages to ensure good behavior. In Russia, entire principalities became vassals to the Golden Horde. Grand princes were forced to travel hundreds of miles to the Mongol capital of Sarai to receive their titles on their knees. There they would bow before the Khan, pay tribute, and wait to be sent back home like borrowed property. And every year, Mongol tax collectors called baskaks would arrive. They didn't come alone. Armed guards stood behind them. They carried tablets stamped with the Khan's seal. Their word was law. No negotiation. No complaints. Resisting a baskak didn't mean jail time. It meant a massacre. One miscalculation, one missed quota, one insult, and an entire village could disappear. In China, tribute went further. Some regions were taxed in salt, others in silk, others in crops. Government bureaus were created just to keep up with the Mongol demands. When a city fell behind, local officials were punished, not the Mongols. It was a system that redirected the blame downward toward the people, toward you. Even if you paid on time, it didn't mean peace. Some khans would raise the quotas unexpectedly. Others used tribute as a loyalty test. If you hesitated, they assumed rebellion. The message was always the same. You live because we allow it. But what did all this tribute buy? For the Mongols, it funded more conquest, more horses, more weapons, more roads. Your silver built the empire that enslaved you. Your children became its foot soldiers. Your harvests fed the riders, who would one day return and demand more. In some cities, tribute became ritualized. Ceremonies were held. Elders bowed low. Bells rang. But the meaning never changed. You were not an ally. You were a source, an account on a ledger. And when rulers tried to get clever holding back payment, hiding resources, or stalling with envoys, they were reminded, quickly and violently, who held the power. One Chinese province, hoping the Mongols had moved on, skipped tribute for a year. They were raised within weeks. The tribute system was a leash, and it was always tightening. It didn't just drain your wealth. It trained you, taught you to obey, to self-censor, to fear. And sometimes, even that fear wasn't enough to keep things stable, because the Mongols didn't just fight the world. They fought each other. For all their unity and conquest, the Mongols were not built for peace. The empire stretched too far. From the cold steppes of Russia to the rice fields of China, from the deserts of Persia to the forests of Eastern Europe, it was too much for one mind to rule. And after Genghis Khan died, the cracks started to show. He had passed his empire to his sons. But sons don't always follow the same script. And grandsons? They write their own. Infighting didn't begin immediately, but it was always simmering. The vast Mongol Empire split into 4 khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the northwest. Each was ruled by descendants of Genghis, but each began acting more like separate kingdoms than branches of a single tree. And when Khans died, succession wasn't smooth. There were no elections, no peaceful handoffs, only power grabs, coups, poisonings, assassinations. Brothers turned on brothers. Cousins plotted behind tents. Entire armies were summoned not to fight enemies, but to settle family squabbles. In 1260, the empire reached a breaking point. Hulagu Khan, who had just finished wiping Baghdad off the map, clashed with Berke, Khan of the Golden Horde. Why? Because Berke was Muslim, and Hulagu had massacred Muslims. That, and Berke didn't like the growing power of his cousin. The result? The Berke-Hulagu War, the first Mongol-on-Mongol civil war. And it wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, in the east, Kublai Khan was declaring himself the Great Khan and setting up his court in China. But not everyone accepted his claim. His cousin, Arik Bokeh, challenged him. Their civil war dragged on for 4 years. Tens of thousands died not to expand the empire, but to keep it in the family. In the middle of it all were the ordinary people, the farmers, traders, craftsmen. They had already survived invasion. Now they were forced to survive occupation by enemies who shared the same last name. Civilians watched as rival Mongol armies marched through their towns, each claiming to be the true rulers. Some switched allegiance just to stay alive. Others were caught between warring khans and punished for imaginary betrayals. Whole cities were forced to feed one army, then another. Refugees flooded the countryside. Harvests failed. Infrastructure decayed. Where once Mongol roads and postal stations had kept the empire humming, now those same networks were used to wage internal war. And the tribute demands? They didn't stop, they doubled. Because each khanate needed more money to fund their conflicts. The peasants had less, but the collectors cared even less. Famine and exhaustion became the new normal. In China, Kublai Khan tried to legitimize his rule with reforms. He built cities, funded art, and tried to balance Mongol dominance with Chinese tradition. But it wasn't enough. Chinese resentment boiled beneath the surface. Revolts began to flicker. And in the West, the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde fought repeatedly. Their wars shattered trade routes. Caravans were looted. Entire regions destabilized. The empire that once enabled the Silk Road now strangled it. Even the famed Mongol unity so terrifying during the conquests dissolved. Military leaders acted on their own. Governors skimmed more from taxes. And Khans began acting more like regional warlords than stewards of a greater whole. The result? The empire didn't collapse. All at once. It rotted, slowly, from the inside. But that didn't make things easier for the people. In fact, Mongol civil wars were often worse than foreign invasions. Because now, there were no clear enemies. No escape. Only shifting allegiances and endless demands. And still, the Mongol engine rolled forward powered by something simple. Something alive. Horses. Millions of them. And their hunger would leave scars across the land. You can't understand the Mongol Empire without understanding the horse. Not just as a mode of transportation. Not just as a battlefield companion. The horse was everything. It was weapon, shelter, currency, sustenance, and symbol. The Mongol war machine wasn't driven by wheels or ships it galloped. Each Mongol warrior had a stable of 5 to 7 horses. They rode them in shifts, rotating constantly to keep them fresh. This allowed them to cover vast distances at speeds other armies couldn't even dream of. 80, sometimes 100 miles a day across deserts, mountains, frozen rivers. No roads needed, no rest required. And unlike other armies that marched with carts of grain and barrels of water, Mongols drank horse blood. Not by slaughtering the animal, but by making a tiny incision in a vein and sipping the blood straight from the neck. It sounds brutal. To the Mongols, it was survival. They could ride for days with no supplies, no breaks, no support lines. They didn't wait for slow-moving wagons. Their entire military was the supply line. But this incredible mobility came with a cost. Horses are hungry, and not just a little. A single horse needs 15 to 30 pounds of grass a day. Multiply that by the thousands of animals in a single Mongol division, and you begin to understand the scale. Wherever the horde passed, the land was devoured, crops trampled, grasslands shredded, orchards flattened. Even if a village wasn't burned, its food system often collapsed under the weight of the herd. Famine followed like a shadow. In the cold months, the horses needed even more to stay warm and nourished. Forests were chopped down for shelter. Ice was broken for water. Sometimes entire regions were stripped bare to feed the animals before the army even moved in. Horses shaped the entire strategy of Mongol warfare. They didn't attack cities randomly. They targeted those located near rich pastures. Cities that relied on fragile irrigation networks, like many in the Middle East, were at even greater risk. Once the Mongols destroyed the canals and let their horses graze the surrounding fields, agriculture collapsed. Nomadic life meant that Mongols could pick up and leave at any time. But the places they passed through couldn't. They were rooted. Their soil needed time. Their people needed harvests. The Mongols needed only grass and hooves. In some cases, Mongol herds would occupy conquered territories for years feeding, multiplying, waiting for the next campaign. Farmers were pushed aside. Shepherds lost their flocks. Fields went fallow. And when the herds moved on, they left. Behind dust, dung, and silence. Even in the places the Mongols settled, their horses stayed central. In cities like Karakorum, and later Kambalik, modern Beijing. Entire neighborhoods were reserved for grazing. The courts had stables larger than palaces. Horse-related taxes were levied. Breeding became political. Control the herds, and you controlled the empire. It also shaped their relationships with other cultures. The Mongols viewed sedentary peoples as soft because they didn't ride. They saw cities as cages, agriculture as slow and weak. The horse was freedom, speed, strength. But to everyone else, the horse was a warning. If you saw one horse, there were more. If the ground trembled, it wasn't an earthquake. It was the horde. If your fields went quiet, it meant the herds had passed through. And yet their use of horses wasn't random. It was methodical, almost scientific, because that's the terrifying truth about the Mongol war engine. It wasn't chaos. It was precision. It's easy to imagine the Mongol invasions as raw fury wave after wave of shrieking warriors, slashing and burning in every direction. But the reality was colder, more exact, more terrifying, because the Mongols didn't just destroy. They studied destruction. They measured it. They turned it into an algorithm of blood. Every Mongol campaign began with research. Before the first arrow flew, they knew the shape of your walls, the size of your army, where your rivers flowed, how deep your wells were. If you had internal divisions, they'd already identified them. If your leadership was weak, they knew exactly who to bribe. Scouts were dispatched months, sometimes years, before an invasion. Disguised as merchants, travelers, monks, they mapped cities by memory, took mental notes of terrain, recorded troop rotations. They didn't leave footprints, just data. Once the intelligence was gathered, the real planning began. Each Mongol army was divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. This decimal system meant any unit could be tracked, commanded, or replaced like a part in a machine. Orders flowed from top to bottom without confusion. Generals met regularly, even across great distances, thanks to mounted couriers who could ride across the empire faster than anyone else on Earth. And Mongol generals weren't chosen by birth. They were chosen by merit. They'd fought in dozens of campaigns, learned every tactic, studied every failure. If a commander lost a battle, through stupidity or arrogance, he was replaced or executed. Their tactics were also flexible. Mongols could surround a city and starve it out, or fake a retreat, draw the defenders into a trap, and then destroy them in open ground. They could flood a town by diverting a river, or burn it with fire arrows and oil-soaked siege engines. Speaking of siege warfare, this is where things got especially advanced. The Mongols didn't invent siege technology, but they collected it. Every time they conquered a new region, they absorbed its engineers. Chinese specialists built catapults that hurled massive stones. Muslim experts taught them to launch flaming projectiles and even early forms of chemical weapons. In some battles, they used trebuchets that could lob diseased corpses over city walls, mixing engineering with biological warfare. They customized their tools for each target. In mountainous terrain, rope bridges. In the desert, camouflage and false retreats. In swampy regions, special paths built for horses. No terrain was too difficult. They adjusted, improved, learned. And once a siege was underway, it wasn't just about breaking walls. It was about breaking minds. Night assaults with drums and horns, battering rams that shook the earth, decoys to confuse defenders. The Mongols often attacked from multiple angles, day after day, night after night, so defenders never knew when the next wave would come. But they didn't just rely on brute force. They used diplomacy as a weapon. Before launching a full siege, they often sent envoys with offers of surrender. If accepted, the city might be spared. If rejected, the city was doomed. This wasn't kindness. It was part of the calculus. A surrendered city meant fewer casualties, more resources, a faster move to the next target. And if surrender was later betrayed, the retribution was designed to be unforgettable. The Mongols logged these betrayals, passed the stories to future generations. They believed memory was part of warfare, that a well-timed massacre today could save them 10 battles tomorrow. And then there were the psychological operations. Sometimes they spared certain cities, not out of mercy, but as propaganda. Let survivors run. Let them talk. Spread fear. Spread paralysis. That, too, was strategy. This wasn't war the way medieval Europe understood it. It was systematized violence, data-driven horror. They made conquest efficient. They made killing scalable. They made fear programmable. And just when you thought you'd seen their worst, you remembered something chilling. They were still improving. And when their gaze turned toward China's great defense, the legendary wall many believed the Mongols would finally be stopped, they weren't. For centuries, the Great Wall of China had stood as a symbol of security. It snaked across mountains and deserts, a colossal scar of stone and brick meant to keep the chaos of the steppes at bay. A promise to the Chinese people: what lies beyond cannot come in. But promises don't stop the wind, and they didn't stop the Mongols. Because when Genghis Khan's forces first turned their attention to the Jin dynasty, who ruled northern China, they didn't see the wall as a barrier. They saw it as a challenge. Let's start with the myth that the Great Wall was some kind of impregnable, continuous superstructure. In reality, it was a series of disconnected fortifications, many made of rammed earth, with sections maintained better than others. At its best, it was a strong deterrent. At its worst, it was a suggestion. The Mongols studied it, probed it, sent scouts to find the weakest points. And once they identified them, they moved fast. One of their favorite tricks? Bribery. They'd approach gatekeepers and offer them wealth, power, or safe passage. And it worked. In multiple instances, Mongol troops simply walked through the wall invited in by terrified or corrupted officials. Other times, they used force. They didn't need to breach the entire wall, just one point. With siege towers, ladders, and battering rams, they targeted isolated garrisons. Once a section fell, the Mongols poured in behind it like a flood through. A broken dam. The wall slowed them. It didn't stop them. And once they were inside, northern China became a hunting ground. The Jin dynasty resisted. They had war elephants, massive armies, and fortified cities. But they were no match for Mongol speed, no match for their strategy, no match for their hunger. One by one, Jin strongholds fell. The Mongols captured cities like Zhongdu modern day, Beijing after brutal sieges. They didn't just loot and leave. They installed themselves, set up administrative centers, built roads, appointed governors. By the time the Jin finally collapsed in 1234, they were just another footnote in the Mongol chronicles. But the Mongols weren't done. Their gaze drifted south, toward the Song dynasty. The Song were richer, more populous, more advanced in many ways. They had gunpowder, printing, mathematics, medicine. But they also had rivers, mountains, and more defensive depth. Still, the Mongols came. The Song resisted valiantly for decades. But eventually, even their defenses buckled under the Mongol storm. The final siege of the Song capital in 1276 saw the royal family captured. The last emperor, a child, drowned by his own ministers to avoid capture. And so, China fell. The land that once built a wall to keep the world out was now ruled by it. But here's the twist. The Mongols didn't just destroy China. They became China. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, declared himself emperor, and founded the Yuan dynasty. He built a new capital in what is now Beijing. He wore Chinese robes, performed Confucian rituals, and adopted much of the local bureaucracy. But make no mistake, this wasn't assimilation. It was domination dressed in silk. For the common people, life under Mongol rule was a strange blend. The taxes were heavier. The officials spoke foreign tongues. The military presence was constant, but trade flourished. Roads improved, and the empire, at least for a while, was stable. The wall still stood, but now it marked not the edge of chaos, but the center of it. And while China reeled, another part of the world was being crushed under the Mongol boot. A place that would be invaded, battered, and broken so thoroughly, surrender wasn't enough. They had to do it again. Korea didn't fall all at once. It was dragged down, slowly ground into the dirt through siege, starvation, betrayal, and exhaustion. Not in a single campaign, but in 7 brutal invasions over the course of nearly 40 years. It began in the early 13th century. At that time, Korea was ruled by the Goryeo dynasty. Caught between rising Mongol power in the north and fading Song resistance in the south, Goryeo found itself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. At first, Goryeo tried diplomacy. The Mongols sent envoys asking for tribute and submission. Goryeo hesitated. They knew what happened to cities that said no, but they also feared losing their independence. So they stalled, delayed, sent half-promises. Genghis Khan didn't like half-promises. In 1231, the Mongols invaded. Their tactics were familiar. By now, fast, relentless, surgical. They bypassed mountain passes, crossed rivers in winter, and struck fortified cities like lightning. They captured Pyongyang, burned towns, took hostages. The Goryeo court, desperate and outmatched, made a bold move. They abandoned the capital, Kaesong, and fled to Ganghwa Island, just off the western coast. It was a fortress surrounded by water, hard to reach with cavalry. From there, they hoped to hold out. And for a while, it worked. The Mongols couldn't reach the island easily, so they set about punishing the mainland instead. And this is where the suffering began in earnest. Every time Goryeo refused to submit fully, the Mongols returned, each time more violent, each time more destructive. Farmlands were torched, wells were poisoned, cities emptied, civilians were slaughtered or enslaved. Buddhist monasteries, once sacred, now filled with terrified refugees, were reduced to rubble. And when the Mongols couldn't break the court, they tried breaking the people. They kidnapped Korean artisans, blacksmiths, and shipbuilders, sending them north to build tools of war. Entire villages were depopulated. Young boys were drafted into Mongol armies. Korean girls were taken as tribute brides or concubines. The Mongols didn't just want obedience, they wanted compliance. In 1258, after nearly 3 decades of intermittent warfare, the Goryeo court finally surrendered in full. But that didn't mean peace. It meant absorption. Korea became a Mongol vassal state. The royal family married into the Mongol elite. Mongol customs flooded the courts. Archery, steppe attire, even naming conventions shifted. Korean politics became a puppet theater actors speaking local language but performing Mongol scripts. And still, the suffering continued. Because now, Korea was a staging ground. The Mongols wanted Japan, but they needed ships, sailors, bases. Korea was forced to provide all of it. In 1274, and again in 1281, tens of thousands of Koreans were conscripted to build and man the invasion fleets that would carry Mongol ambitions across the sea. Laborers died by the thousands building warships. Families were torn apart, villages emptied. The cost was staggering. And yet, Japan was never conquered. Both invasions were stopped more by typhoons than by samurai. The so-called kamikaze, or divine winds, shredded Mongol fleets and drowned their soldiers by the thousands. For Korea, there was no divine wind, just decades of blood and silence. And when the Mongols finally withdrew, they left behind scorched earth, broken dynasties, and a culture forever altered. The Goryeo dynasty limped forward under Mongol shadow, surviving only because it had bent early and often. And yet, despite everything, Korea survived. But not every target of Mongol ambition was so lucky, because across the sea, in a land of swords and storms, the Mongols would face a new kind of resistance, one that came not from men, but from nature itself. The Mongols had steamrolled kingdoms, burned libraries, toppled empires. From Persia to China to Eastern Europe, their advance seemed unstoppable. So when Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, set his eyes on Japan, the question wasn't if they could take it. It was how long it would take to finish the job. In 1268, Kublai sent a letter to the Japanese shogunate, politely demanding tribute and submission. Japan didn't respond. Not a word, not a messenger, not a gift. Just silence. To Kublai Khan, silence was insult. But it would take a few years for him to act. Building a fleet to cross the sea was no small task for a people born on the steppe. The Mongols were cavalry experts, not sailors. So they turned to their new vassals in Korea. And Korea paid the price. Tens of thousands of Korean laborers were conscripted to build ships and provide provisions. Wood was stripped from the forests. Food stores were drained. Soldiers were drafted, many against their will. By 1274, the first invasion fleet was ready. It was a terrifying armada. Around 900 ships. Up to 30,000 troops. Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese warriors. They landed on the Japanese island of Tsushima, slaughtered the defenders, then pushed on to Hakata Bay on Kyushu. The Japanese samurai fought back fiercely, but they weren't prepared for Mongol tactics. The invaders used massed archery, coordinated strikes, and even early forms of gunpowder bombs that exploded with deafening force. The samurai used to ritualized one-on-one duels were overwhelmed, but then the weather turned. A storm rolled in, and the Mongols, unfamiliar with Japan's volatile coastal winds, panicked. Their ships weren't anchored properly. As the winds grew, boats collided, capsized, or were driven back to sea. The invaders retreated. Kublai was furious. So he did what Mongols always did. He tried again. Bigger, deadlier. In 1281, a second invasion was launched. This time, the numbers were staggering. Over 4,000 ships, as many as 140,000 troops. The largest seaborne invasion in world history at the time. Two separate fleets, one from Korea, one from southern China, were to converge and crush Japan in a pincer movement. But again, the Japanese resisted. They had learned from the first invasion. This time, they built walls along the coast, fortified beaches, deployed their own fleet to harass the Mongols while they were still at sea. And then it happened again. The storm. A typhoon slammed into the Mongol fleet just as they attempted to regroup offshore. For 2 full days, the wind howled and the Zaos. Sea raged. Ships broke apart on the rocks. Soldiers drowned by the tens of thousands. Some who made it to shore were cut down by waiting samurai. Others were hunted through the hills and executed. By the end of it, as many as 100,000 men were dead. The Mongols never tried again. The Japanese called the storms kamikaze, divine wind. They believed the gods had intervened to save their homeland. And maybe they did. Because had the Mongols succeeded, Japanese culture, governance, and history would have been rewritten entirely. But divine winds didn't blow for everyone. And back on the continent, in lands without typhoons or mountains, the Mongols continued their march. And wherever they went, something precious died. Not just people, but memory. Because one of the quietest horrors of the Mongol invasions was the erasure of history itself. You can rebuild a house. You can replant the field. You can bury the dead. But once a library burns, it's gone forever. And the Mongols burned a lot of libraries. When people speak of the destruction caused by the Mongol invasions, they usually count the bodies, entire cities emptied, populations reduced to ash. But the true scale of loss goes deeper, because what also vanished was knowledge, language, art, identity, whole worlds that lived on paper and parchment. Let's go back to Baghdad, 1258. The House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah was the beating heart of Islamic intellectual life. Centuries, it had been collecting texts from across the known world: Greek, Persian, Indian, Egyptian. Treatises on astronomy, medicine, philosophy, mathematics. Scholars from different faiths translated and debated side by side. It was the ancient, world's closest thing to a think tank. When the Mongols arrived, they didn't spare it. The books were thrown into the Tigris. According to chroniclers, the river ran black with ink. And whether or not that detail is literally true doesn't matter. Because the point is, they didn't just kill people. They killed ideas. The same thing happened across the empire. In Nishapur, Herat, Merv, and other cities of Central Asia, local libraries were destroyed in the fires that followed conquest. Texts lost included ancient medical manuals, poems, histories of early dynasties, and detailed scientific observations that had never been recorded elsewhere. In China, the Mongols eventually supported scholarship, but during the conquest itself, entire Confucian archives were wiped out. Scrolls trampled, stone inscriptions shattered, schools reduced to charred beams. In Eastern Europe, monasteries were looted and their libraries ransacked. Religious texts, legal documents, and even early chronicles of Slavic history disappeared into smoke. Some villages today exist without records older than the 13th century, not because they were never written, but because the Mongols erased them. And it wasn't just formal learning. Oral traditions were also crushed, elders killed, storytellers silenced. Songs stopped being sung. Entire dialects lost when the last speaker was cut down or carried off. Because the Mongols weren't interested in preserving your version of the world. If it didn't serve their empire, it didn't matter. Unless, of course, it was useful. Engineers? Kept alive? Architects? Sometimes spared. Physicians, scribes, and astronomers? Taken for Mongol service. But poets? Philosophers? Historians? Those could be liabilities. People who remembered a different order. A different truth. A truth that didn't worship the Khan. And when history is destroyed, something else happens. People forget who they were. Generations later, survivors of the Mongol invasions lived in cultural silence. They had no written records of their ancestors, no guidebooks to their past, no blueprints for rebuilding. Entire civilizations had to start over with fragments. A poem half remembered, a song passed down in whispers, a ruined wall with inscriptions no one could read anymore. The worst part? The Mongols knew this was power. They understood that to truly conquer, you don't just control land, you control memory. And so, many of the peoples who fell under their hooves didn't just lose battles. They lost their place in time. But even when the killing stopped, the fear didn't, because the Mongols knew how to weaponize more than fire. They knew how to weaponize anticipation. Sometimes, the Mongols didn't even have to show up. The mere rumor of them was enough to break a city. A rider appears on the horizon. A trader arrives with news. A refugee collapses at the gate's close. In tatters, eyes wide, whispering of fire and ash. That's all it took. Panic sped faster than arrows. People stopped working. Markets shut down. Defenders debated desertion. And in the courtrooms and palaces, rulers whispered to each other, "Are we next?" This was Mongol warfare before a single weapon was drawn. The strategy was simple. Destroy one city so thoroughly that 10 others collapse from fear alone. And they cultivated that fear with care. Let's say your neighbor resisted and was annihilated. The Mongols left behind a smoldering ruin. No defenders, no walls, just silence and skulls. Lots of skulls, arranged deliberately stacked in. Pyramids hung from city gates, displayed like trophies. It wasn't just cruelty. It was messaging. Survivors always a few, always just enough, were let go on purpose. Sent back to their homelands with shaking hands and stories no one could sleep after hearing. They weren't prisoners. They were delivery systems for terror. In some cases, the Mongols would bypass a city entirely. Just march nearby. Camp in view. Wait. Let the fear rot the place from the inside. Sometimes that was all it took. And when they did arrive, they kept the illusion going. They wore armor painted with false insignias to appear like different armies. They lit extra campfires at night to inflate their numbers. They used dummies mounted on horses to simulate larger cavalry forces. Entire cities surrendered without realizing they had been tricked. Their generals also studied timing. Attacks came at dawn, during festivals, at harvest time, whenever the enemy was least ready. Or they came in the dead of night, with horns, and drums blaring to simulate a horde twice its size. And then there were the psychological torments during sieges. In some cases, they sent prisoners to the walls of their own cities' hands bound, screaming for surrender. In others, they used traders from previous conquests as intermediaries. See? We let him live. You could be next. But they could also flip the script. When cities surrendered early and without resistance, the Mongols sometimes rewarded them, publicly and generously. They left the market open, let the temples stand, praised the local leaders. It was a calculated performance, because word got around. The message was, submit early and live like nothing happened. Resist and vanish. That binary decision haunted every city leader in their path. Some cracked under the pressure. Others turned tyrannical executing dissenters to prevent rumors of surrender. In a twisted way, the Mongols didn't have to destabilize every kingdom. The rulers did it to themselves. Even those who lived under Mongol rule weren't spared the mental weight. Banners of the Khan were flown high. His image circulated on. Coins, seals, and stamps. Mongol messengers came and went untouchable and armed. Local officials were watched. Villagers were reminded constantly, we let you live. And beneath that surface, a question pulsed like a heartbeat. What if they come back? Because everyone knew that peace under Mongol rule wasn't peace. It was a pause. A moment between storms. You didn't know if you were a vassal or a hostage. You didn't know if this year's tribute was enough. You didn't know if your children would be taken. You didn't even know if the stories you told were true or just inventions whispered to make the nightmares feel manageable. But one thing you did know, the Mongols were watching. And if you stepped out of line, the silence would break, and the hooves would return. For those who lived through it, especially the young, their lives were shaped by trauma, and their future, it was a memory of something already gone. Because the children who survived the Mongol invasions weren't raised in cities. They were raised in craters. If you were a child during the Mongol invasions, your world didn't just change, it disintegrated. You might wake up in a familiar house, but go to sleep in a burned field. One day you had a mother. The next, a Mongol archer used her as a shield. Your village priest or elder, the one who knew the old songs, was gone, dragged away or cut down. The neighbor who once gave you honey cakes, now silent forever. You weren't raised by your parents. You were raised by what was left. For the children who survived, survival often meant forgetting. Forgetting where you were born, what your family believed in, how people used to live. Language dissolved. Traditions crumbled. You adapted or died. Some were taken by the Mongols. Directly. Young boys were absorbed into the military machine, trained to ride, shoot, kill. They were renamed, retaught. Sometimes they were raised alongside Mongol children, treated not as captives, but as future soldiers. To live, they had to become what had once terrified them. Others were enslaved. Girls became tribute wives, concubines, or servants in Mongol or allied households. Sometimes they were married off to seal alliances. Sometimes they were just passed around, nameless, voiceless. If you were especially skilled, if you could read, draw, sew, craft jewelry, you might be spared a hard life. But even then, your skills were used for someone else's glory. Your hands created beauty in a world where everything else had been torn down. And what about those who weren't taken? They stayed behind in empty towns, raised by distant relatives, by strangers, by no one at all. They scavenged from ruins, learned to cook with whatever was left, watched their elders flinch at every horn call. They learned quickly not to ask questions, not to sing too loudly, not to remember too much, because memory was dangerous. And then there were the half-children, the ones born of conquest, offspring of Mongol fathers and local mothers. These children existed between two worlds, accepted by neither. In some cases, they became bridges between cultures, translators, scribes, messengers. In others, they were exiled, hidden away, or left to fend for themselves. Imagine growing up not knowing if your name is yours, not knowing which side your blood belongs to, not knowing whether to fear the riders or call them father. The trauma wasn't just individual, it was generational. Entire communities lost their rituals. Weddings happened in silence. Funerals with no chants, no prayers, just dirt and hands. Elders who knew the stories died without passing them down. Young people inherited lands they didn't recognize, gods they didn't understand, and histories that no longer made sense. But some remembered. Some wrote things down quietly, secretly. A monk hiding pages in the walls of a chapel. A mother whispering old songs into a baby's ear, hoping they'd carry it forward. A former scholar teaching children by drawing diagrams in the dust. These fragments, these stubborn embers, kept something alive. But mostly, the children of the Mongol conquests were born into silence. Silence where libraries used to be. Silence where songs used to echo. Silence where the future used to grow. And yet, strangely, out of that silence came a new world. Because the Mongols didn't just destroy, they connected. And from those connections came trade, travel, language, and bloodlines. A legacy that still lives, in places you'd never expect. It's possible, without ever knowing it, that you carry the Mongol legacy inside you. Not in your history books, in your genes. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land, he seeded it. According to a landmark 2003 genetic study, about 16 million men alive today share a Y chromosome profile that can be traced back to a single male ancestor who lived roughly 800 years ago in the Mongol Empire. The timing, geography, and spread make one name rise above all others. Genghis Khan. It's one of the largest known single human genetic legacies in history. And it didn't stop with him. The Mongols, particularly the royal Borjigin line, intermarried. widely often strategically. Marriages were tools of diplomacy. Conquered rulers' daughters were taken as wives or concubines. These unions helped solidify control, bind new regions to the empire, and leave a literal imprint on the future. The result? Mongol blood runs deep from Central Asia through Russia, the Middle East, and into parts of Eastern Europe. Some descendants can trace it directly. For most, it's buried in the background, an ancestral shadow moving through veins. And centuries. But the legacy isn't just biological. The Mongols altered geography. Cities like Samarkand, Tabriz, and Beijing were reshaped by their influence. Borders shifted. New trade routes emerged. Caravanserais roadside inns built across the Silk Road allowed merchants to travel safely from China to Europe for the first time in centuries. Along these routes, ideas moved too. Gunpowder spread west. Papermaking advanced. Language evolved. Arabic numerals met Chinese accounting. Mongol coinage influenced currency systems across Asia. Some administrative methods like census taking, military logistics, and courier systems would be adopted by future empires from the Ottomans to the Russians. And religion? Mongols were spiritual omnivores. They practiced shamanism, yes, but they also tolerated Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Under Mongol rule, a Jewish merchant, a Muslim scholar, and a Nestorian priest could all walk into the same court without being executed. In some regions, it was the most religiously tolerant regime in medieval history. But all this came with a paradox, because the same empire that fostered trade also destroyed cities. The same Khans who encouraged science also burned universities. The same rulers who promoted diversity also enforced total obedience. It's a legacy of contradiction. The Mongol name inspires awe and revulsion. On one hand, they left a connected world a global system centuries ahead of its time. On the other, they soaked entire landscapes in blood. And that complexity still echoes today. You can find Mongol cavalry formations studied in modern military academies. Mongol law codes debated in historical legal circles. Even phrases in modern languages, like Persian and Russian, contain linguistic remnants of Mongol governance. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His face is on money, his name on airports and vodka bottles. Statues of him stretch stories high. But elsewhere, the same name is still spoken like a curse. So what does it mean to inherit this legacy? To live in a world shaped by galloping hooves, flaming arrows, and shattered temples? It means understanding that history doesn't come with clean edges. Empires don't just die. They melt into the future. And the Mongols, through conquest, commerce, violence, and vision, melted into us. But what drove them to keep going? To move past every mountain, across every river, deeper into lands they'd never seen? It wasn't just greed. It was something harder to understand. Something that didn't stop, even when there was nothing left to conquer. By the time the Mongols had carved up Asia, shattered Europe's borders, and erased entire civilizations from the map, you'd think they might stop, take a breath, settle down, rule their kingdoms in peace. But they didn't. They just kept going. Over mountains, across oceans, into forests, deserts, jungles. No terrain was too harsh, no kingdom too distant. When there were no enemies left in one direction, they simply turned and looked in another. Why? Part of it was cultural. Steppe life wasn't about planting roots. It was about movement. Identity came from action, not architecture. A Mongol didn't measure success in harvests or temples. He measured it in distance, covered, and enemies defeated. But part of it was something deeper. Genghis Khan had left behind more than an empire. He'd left behind an obligation. His descendants weren't just conquerors. They were heirs to a vision, a divine one in their eyes. The world had to be united under one rule, one law, one sky. Anything less was unfinished business. And so, conquest became compulsion. Each new Khan felt the pressure of legacy. To not expand was to dishonor Genghis. To pause was to risk weakness. Expansion became its own kind of fuel, something that kept the internal rivalries in check, the armies occupied, and the tribute flowing. But that kind of machine can't run forever. It starts to eat itself. Resources get stretched, garrisons thinned, commanders burned out, communication slows, and paranoia takes over. Every border becomes a threat, every ally a potential traitor. The only solution? Keep moving, keep conquering. Don't look back. The Mongol campaigns into Southeast Asia are perfect examples. Places like Vietnam, Burma, and Java didn't hold the same wealth or strategic value as Persia or China. But the Mongols invaded anyway, again and again, despite brutal terrain, hostile climates, and staggering casualties. Because stopping wasn't an option, neither was peace. Even within their own empire, the Mongols couldn't stop. If they weren't conquering new lands, they were crushing rebellions, fighting rivals, or enforcing tribute through threats of annihilation. Some Khans saw visions. Others consulted oracles. All believed that destiny demanded they ride farther. And what about the soldiers? They were often conscripted, dragged from home at a young age, conditioned to follow orders without question. To them, motion was survival. Conquest was normal. If you weren't marching, you were waiting to die. And so the cycle continued, until the empire started to stretch too thin, until the routes got longer, the enemies more unpredictable, the costs too high. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Entire continents had been reshaped, rivers diverted, languages erased, cities renamed or vanished. And yet, the legacy of the Mongol invasions wasn't just about what they did. It was about what they left behind. A world built on ashes. A silence that still echoes. But also something stranger. A connection. Because even in their most violent moments, the Mongols were building bridges. Not the kind you walk across, but the kind you live in. Empires. Trade, science, memory. All forged in the furnace of fire and fear. And for all their fury, for all their reach, the one thing they couldn't conquer was time. You've probably heard the phrase, the sun never sets on the empire. It's been used for Rome, for Britain, for global powers that spanned continents. But with the Mongols, it wasn't just about territory. It was about momentum. The Mongol Empire was a machine in motion. And like any machine built without brakes, it couldn't stop itself, even when it wanted to. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his sons and grandsons didn't pause to consolidate. They just kept riding. Agide pushed into Eastern Europe. Hulagu moved into the Islamic world. Kublai swept south to absorb China. It was like the empire itself had taken on a life of its own, one that demanded constant forward motion. Why? Partly because of logistics. You'd think controlling more land would give you more stability. But in reality, it created more borders to patrol, more rebellions to suppress, more enemies to anticipate. The larger the empire got, the more it had to keep expanding just to hold itself together. Tributary states didn't stay loyal on fear alone. That fear had to be refreshed through visits, threats, or brutal punishments. Each year, a few more troops sent to punish someone who hadn't paid up. Each decade, another loyal province showing signs of dissent. And every time that happened, the horde rolled out again. But there was also pressure from within. Every new Khan had to prove himself not just through diplomacy or governance, but through conquest. The legacy of Genghis loomed large. If you didn't expand the empire during your reign, what were you? A caretaker? A placeholder? Not a real ruler. Every successor felt it. Expand or be forgotten. And then there were the generals. Veteran commanders needed rewards, usually land, treasure, and titles. And where did that come from? New conquests. If there was no war, there were no spoils. No spoils meant unhappy commanders. And unhappy commanders meant coup. Expansion wasn't just ambition, it was insurance. Even the rank-and-file soldiers were caught in the cycle. These were men born and raised in motion. The idea of staying in one place, planting fields, and paying taxes, that wasn't Mongol life. It was weakness. Cities meant softness. Stillness meant death. To many of them, if the army wasn't moving, it was rotting. But it went deeper still. There was a spiritual engine behind all of it. The Mongols believed the eternal blue sky Tengri had chosen their lineage to rule the world. That the conquests weren't just strategy. They were sacred. A fulfillment of cosmic order. As long as there was unconquered land, the job wasn't done. And so they went. Into Vietnam's jungles. Up the icy rivers of Russia. Across the burning plains of Anatolia. Sometimes they won. Sometimes they didn't. But stopping? That was never on the table. The result was an empire that couldn't sit still. And when something that big and that fast keeps moving without pause, without rest, without a plan for peace, it starts eating itself from the inside out. The borders stretched, the center thinned, governors grew corrupt, soldiers grew restless. And those tasked with holding it all together, they lived lives defined by loyalty, pressure, and fear, because to serve the Khan was a brutal privilege. For outsiders, the Mongol military seemed like a force of nature-flawless formations, perfect coordination, unstoppable power. But inside the machine, it was a different story. Serving the Khan meant sacrificing everything. From the youngest, scout to the highest general, everyone lived under the same shadow. One mistake, one hesitation, and you were dead. Not demoted, not reassigned. Dead. The Mongols didn't tolerate failure. If a unit disobeyed orders in battle, they weren't. Punished, they were executed. Sometimes every 10th man was killed, regardless of guilt, just to drive the point home. It was called decimation, and it kept everyone sharp. But the cost went beyond discipline. Life in the Mongol army meant endless motion. You weren't stationed somewhere. You moved, year-round, in heat, snow, rain, dust storms. Campaigns didn't pause for winter. In fact, some of the worst ones started in winter, because that's when rivers froze and could be crossed. You slept in your saddle, ate dried meat and horse blood. Sometimes you went weeks without fire to avoid detection. If your horse died, you fell behind. If you fell behind, you were left. If you were left, you died. Even generals weren't safe. They had glory, yes, but only as long as they delivered. Failed to take a city, you might be executed by your own soldiers before the Khan even found out. That's how tightly loyalty was enforced. In one case, a Mongol general who lost a battle in India killed himself before facing the Khan's judgment. He knew what was coming. But there were rewards, too. If you survived long enough and followed every order without question, you might rise. A stable boy could become a commander. A bandit could become a governor. Rank wasn't always about blood. It was about usefulness. Still, promotions didn't mean comfort. Even high-ranking officers had to live in tents, ride for months, risk ambushes. They carried multiple weapons, memorized hundreds of formations, trained constantly. Some commanders kept 3 horses at a time just to survive forced marshes, and they were watched. The Mongol Empire had an internal network of spies and informants that kept tabs even on its own elites. Betrayal was expected. Paranoia was part of the job. What's more, you weren't just fighting for your life. You were fighting for your family's life. Mongol soldiers who deserted or disobeyed didn't just pay with their own blood. Their families were punished too, imprisoned, enslaved, or executed. Entire bloodlines erased because one man faltered. So why do it? Some had no choice. Conscription was common especially in conquered regions. Others saw it as the only path out of poverty or anonymity. Many were true believers convinced they were chosen by heaven to spread order through destruction. And others were just really good at war. The Mongol military was a pressure cooker. It crushed weakness. It refined brutality. It demanded total loyalty and rewarded success with more responsibility, more risk, more danger. There were no long retirements, no peaceful outposts. You fought until you died or until the empire collapsed around you. And when campaigns stretched into frozen mountains or the endless Russian plains, the price of service grew even steeper. Because Mongol conquests didn't stop for the weather, and winter didn't care who you served. If the Mongol invasions were terrifying in the spring, they were something else entirely in the winter. Cold doesn't care if you're a conqueror. It chews through armor. It turns roads to glass and rivers to traps. It kills your horses slowly, then turns to you. But the Mongols weren't like other armies. They used winter. They studied how rivers froze. They learned when they could become highways instead of barriers. While other armies bunkered down for the season, the Mongols moved. Silent, icy, unstoppable. In the 1240s, they stormed through Kievan Rus, Russia, and Ukraine during winter. Snow covered the forests. Temperatures plummeted. But the Mongols saw opportunity. The frozen rivers of the Dnieper and the Volga became solid, flat roads. No mud, no bridges, no choke points. They rode directly into cities that had assumed they'd be safe until spring. And those cities? They didn't stand a chance. Frost cracked the walls. Starving populations couldn't flee. Wells froze. The wind carried sound too far for secret movements. Every defender's breath betrayed them. The Mongols didn't mind. The cold, they were born in it. Raised on the steppe, where winter was just another part of life. Their clothing layered wool, fur-lined coats, thick felt boots was made for it. Their yurts were insulated. Their diets filled with protein and fat. And their horses? Short, stocky, winter-hardened animals with thick coats and instincts sharper than any general's orders. In contrast, their enemies, many of them city dwellers or agricultural peoples, collapsed in the cold. Armies froze in place. Supply lines broke. Food spoiled. Even iron weapons grew brittle in the frost. In Poland and Hungary, the Mongols crossed mountain passes that had been declared impassable in winter. They proved everyone wrong, then proved it didn't matter by annihilating everyone on the other side. Winter also gave them a psychological edge. Imagine being a soldier in a fortress in January. Food running low. Fires barely keeping the cold out. And then, out of the blizzard, drums, horns, hoofbeats. It wasn't just terrifying. It was impossible. The Mongols weren't supposed to be there, but they were. And once they arrived, they brought the storm with them. Sieges became even more brutal. Hunger hit faster. Disease spread. Firewood ran out. Water froze in the wells. Some defenders resorted to eating leather, rats, even family pets. Others simply surrendered, too tired to die fighting. But winter didn't always favor the Mongols. There were campaigns, especially in Southeast Asia, where they were unprepared for the humidity and slammed by unexpected winter rains. Horses drowned in swamps. Frost hit when they had no shelter. Tropical disease claimed more lives than enemy swords. Still, more often than not, They bent winter to their will. They even coordinated winter attacks across thousands of miles. One branch of the army would ride through the Caucasus, while another looped through Crimea. Both converged in a snowstorm, like a pincer made of ice and steel. It wasn't just warfare. It was weatherfare. The environment was a tool, a weapon. And for those caught in it, villagers, defenders, refugees, winter under the Mongols didn't mean waiting for spring. It meant waiting for mercy, which never came. And as Mongol rule expanded, not everyone died in battle or siege. Some were slowly crushed under paperwork, quotas, and orders they couldn't disobey. Because when the arrows stopped flying, another kind of death arrived. The Mongol conquests are remembered for fire and blood, but the empire's true engine of control was something colder: paper, ink, tables of numbers, census scrolls, tax ledgers, records of land, grain, people. The Mongols didn't just kill. With swords, they killed with systems. After the battles ended and the smoke cleared, a different kind of army arrived: scribes, clerks, translators, and tax collectors. Their weapons were seals, abacuses, and stamps carved with the authority of the Khan. And for many survivors, this second wave felt even more suffocating than the first. It started with the census. Every household was recorded, heads counted, livestock measured, land surveyed, names translated into Mongol phonetics and copied by hand. If you were alive, the Mongols wanted to know exactly what you could produce, how many sons you had, how many bags of millet you could owe, how many bricks your village owed for the next fort. And the price for lying? Execution. The census wasn't just a tally, it was a blueprint for survival. If your name was missing or misrecorded, you might be taxed twice or forgotten, which meant you no longer legally existed. And that meant no protection. Entire villages were punished because a clerk wrote the wrong number on the wrong form. Then came the tax system. Each region was given quotas tribute in grain, gold, animals, textiles, or slaves. And if those numbers weren't met, it wasn't just your land that suffered. You did. In Persia, cities were crushed not by sieges, but by tax overload. Irrigation systems broke down, but demands didn't change. Farmers fled their fields. Harvests failed, but the Mongols didn't adjust the quotas. They just demanded the same payment anyway. And when the village couldn't pay, executions, enslavement, whole communities exiled. Their names crossed off the rolls. In China, the Yuan dynasty introduced paper money backed by precious metals. It was revolutionary, but it also meant inflation, corruption, and tighter control. Refuse the new currency? You're a traitor. Counterfeit it? You're tortured. Even trade became a form of control. Merchants had to carry a pesa, a tablet, granting permission to travel, stay in Mongol inns, and avoid local tolls. But if you lost it, or if someone forged one in your name, you were jailed or worse. The pesa was like a passport, a contract, and a collar all in one. And through all of this, bureaucrats held enormous power. Some were local collaborators. Others were imported from other conquered territories. They didn't speak your language. They didn't understand your customs. But they did control your future. They were judge, tax assessor, and census officer all in one. Their word could erase your property. Their pen could doom your family. And you couldn't appeal, because appeals meant delays. Delays meant disobedience. Disobedience meant death. So people obeyed. They paid. They kept quiet, but inside, they collapsed. Whole generations lived under ledgers, afraid not of swords, but of stamps, not of generals, but of accountants, not of war, but of compliance. And in some ways, this was the Mongols' most efficient conquest. They didn't need to burn your home. They just needed to file your name. And once you were filed, once you were numbered, once your field was measured and your sons registered, you belonged to them. And for some people, especially women, that was just the beginning. Because under Mongol rule, a woman's fate could swing from throne room to hell in a single breath. To be a woman during the Mongol invasions was to live on the sharpest edge of a knife. You could be everything: a queen, a captive, a political pawn, a war trophy. Your fate was fluid. It depended on who your father was, who your captor was, whether you were beautiful, useful, invisible, or inconvenient. Let's start at the top. Mongol noblewomen, especially within the Borjigin clan, could wield extraordinary power. Genghis Khan's own mother, Holon, had shaped his early worldview, raising him in exile, teaching him survival, loyalty, and strategy. And after Genghis died, it was women like Trajin Khaitan and Sorgatani Beki who ruled behind the scenes, some even openly, as regents, diplomats, and administrators. These weren't figureheads. Trajin essentially ran the empire during her son Gedi's reign. She negotiated treaties, appointed governors, and directed entire military campaigns. Sorgatani was so politically savvy that even foreign chroniclers called her one of the most remarkable women of her time. But this privilege was limited to elite Mongol women, and even they weren't always safe. If a noblewoman stepped out of line, she could still be executed or replaced, her children taken, her influence stripped away. Power didn't mean immunity. It just meant a higher cliff to fall from. For most women, especially in conquered territories, life under Mongol rule was far more brutal. Let's talk about concubinage. After a city fell, women were often rounded up by age and appearance. The most attractive were distributed to high-ranking commanders or sent to the Khan himself. Others were used to reward loyal soldiers. In some cases, thousands of women were taken from a single city. They weren't married. They weren't protected. They were possessions. Some bore children. Some were traded again. Others were discarded or executed if they became burdens or threats. But not all women were reduced to this fate. In some cases, their skills saved them. Midwives, herbalists, textile workers, singers, they could be spared if a Mongol commander saw value in them. Some women even gained influence through artistry or craftsmanship, becoming fixtures in royal courts far from home. But the line between valued and exploited was always razor thin. In cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, or Kaifeng, women who had once been scholars' wives, merchants' daughters, or temple acolytes suddenly found themselves enslaved, separated from families, stripped of identity, renamed. Others were left behind in the rubble, widows with no support, girls with no guardians, elderly women surviving in shattered neighborhoods, scavenging food from ruins, hiding from patrols who might still requisition them. In some cases, religion was no shield. Christian nuns were raped, Buddhist priestesses enslaved, Muslim women, even if veiled and protected by tradition, were still subjected to Mongol law, which meant no protection. And yet, amid all this, some women adapted. They learned new languages, married into Mongol families for survival, passed down hidden versions of their culture through lullabies, embroidery, rituals smuggled into daily chores. Because women remember. Even when history doesn't record their names, they carry it in stories, gestures, recipes, and scars. The Mongol invasions didn't just leave ashes and bones. They left fractured bloodlines. Mothers raising children who no longer looked like them. Girls taught to forget their names. Families broken so completely that even descendants today don't know who their great-great-grandmothers were. And for those women who did survive long enough to tell the tale, most didn't speak, not because they couldn't, but because no, One wanted to hear it. And in the cities where the screams had finally stopped, the survivors made a different choice. They tried to forget. When the dust settled, when the last Mongol banners vanished beyond the horizon, cities didn't celebrate. They cleaned, they buried, and they tried to forget. What else could they do? You wake up in a place that used to be your home, but the streets are ash, the fountains run dry, the market square is silent. The buildings that once echoed with prayers or laughter are broken, cracked, some of them missing altogether. And the people? Most of them are gone. Those who remained tried to rebuild, but they didn't just rebuild structures. They rebuilt memory, and often that meant burying it. In cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Urgench, the trauma ran so deep that later generations stopped talking about what had happened. Entire communities skipped over the Mongol years in their oral histories, as if they had simply been swallowed by a storm. And in some cases, they rewrote the story. Chronicles crafted. Decades after the invasions, turned defeats into divine punishment, or sometimes divine intervention. Cities that had been helpless victims reframed their collapse as part of a cosmic plan, or a cleansing, or a test. Memory became myth, and myth was easier to carry. But forgetting had practical uses too. If you were a new leader in a ruined city, you didn't want people clinging to the past. You needed them focused on the future, on taxes, farming, obedience. Dwelling on mass graves and shattered temples didn't help anyone. Better to clear the rubble, paint over the scars, and pretend the wounds weren't still open. In China, under the Yuan dynasty, some Confucian scholars quietly omitted certain battles from local histories. In Persia, cities built new walls over the old ruins, refusing to excavate what had come before. In Russia, some chronicles went eerily silent during the worst years, just blank entries, like time itself had stopped. This wasn't denial. It was survival. Because remembering came with risk. What if the Mongols came back? What if talking about resistance made your city look rebellious again? So people silenced themselves, passed down neutral stories, taught their children the version that wouldn't get them killed. But not everyone could forget. There were signs, markers, shadows. A temple rebuilt using bricks from the burned one. A street still called Widow's Row. A tree in the square older than the massacre, its bark marked with blade scars. Sometimes you didn't need to remember, because the city remembered for you. But over time, even those markers faded. Languages changed, names changed, populations shifted. And one day, someone would walk those streets and wonder why they felt so heavy. Why the well in the center of town was always avoided. Why the foundation of that quiet warehouse looked suspiciously like a collapsed tomb. The answer? Forgotten, filed away, lost. And still, under the surface of these cities, under the concrete and asphalt, the restaurants and apartments, bones remain. Bones of people whose names were erased, whose families vanished, whose only legacy is a slight dip in the soil where the ground never quite settled right. Some places are built over cemeteries. Others are cemeteries. But in this empire of forgetting, there were also those who thrived. Because for every victim of the Mongols, there was someone who profited. It might sound strange and impossible, even but not everyone wept when the Mongols arrived. For some, it was the beginning of the best years of their lives. Traders, diplomats, collaborators, opportunists, entire cities, classes and families who saw the Mongol wave not as a disaster, but as a door opening, and they walked right through it. Let's start with the merchants. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence, created the safest, most extensive trade network the world had seen up to that point. Roads that had been infested with bandits were suddenly guarded by Mongol patrols. Robbery became a capital offense. Caravans carried not just goods, But Mongol issued passports that guaranteed safe passage across borders, provinces, continents. From the Mediterranean to the Pacific, one political system now oversaw the Silk Road. You could send silks from Hangzhou and receive spices in Baghdad. You could trade wool in Samarkand and see it sold in Cairo. This stability turned local merchants into global ones, and many got rich, very rich. Italian traders, like the famous Polo family, benefited immensely. Venice and Genoa expanded their reach into Asia. They brought back stories, technologies, and fortunes. Some even settled temporarily. In Mongol courts, with their language skills and outsider status, gave them surprising leverage. Then there were the bureaucrats. When the Mongols conquered a region, they didn't wipe the slate clean. They needed administrators, people who knew how to manage tax rolls, build infrastructure, and write legal codes. In China, Persia, and Central Asia, whole classes of scribes, scholars, and accountants found new jobs under Mongol rule. They served the Khans, and in return, they received land, titles, and protection. Many of them weren't even Mongol. The Mongols didn't care where you were from. If you were useful, you were in. That meant Persian viziers, Arab doctors, Armenian merchants, Chinese engineers, even Russian scouts. Talent beat lineage. Utility beat loyalty. This made for strange alliances. In one corner of the empire, a Nestorian Christian might be appointed governor. In another, a Mongol general married a Turkic noblewoman and adopted her customs. These intersections weren't always fair, but they opened doors that had been sealed for centuries. And then there were the religious elites. The Mongols practiced a surprising degree of religious tolerance, mostly because they believed no one religion could monopolize truth. This gave monks, priests, and mystics a strange kind of mobility. Buddhist lamas served as advisors. Sufi leaders received land. Christian missionaries traveled deeper into Asia than they ever had before. Some used this access to build networks. Others used it to build wealth. Not everyone used Mongol rule to serve others. Some exploited it for personal gain. Collaborators local. Rulers who betrayed their own people for Mongol favor were rewarded handsomely. They got positions, fortresses, sometimes entire cities under their command. They crushed rebellions in their own lands on behalf of the Khan. And yes, they were despised, but they survived. Some even thrived. Of course, this prosperity came at a price. Those who aligned with the Mongols were always walking a tightrope. If they failed to meet expectations, showed signs of rebellion, or simply fell out of favor, the punishment was swift and final. A single missed tribute shipment could erase everything. Still, many chose to risk it, because under the old orders, they'd been nothing. A low-born merchant, a disgraced noble, a forgotten translator. But under the Mongols, they became something. In the end, the Mongol Empire didn't just create victims. It created winners, not many, but enough to prove that even in the most brutal conquests, opportunity lingers. And sometimes it hides in the ashes. But the victories never lasted forever, because an empire built on fire and fear eventually consumes itself. Nothing breaks like an empire. It doesn't collapse overnight. It unravels. First a fray here, a split there. Then the scenes go, and suddenly, what once looked eternal lies scattered in pieces. The Mongol Empire sprawling, mighty, and monstrous was. No exception. It began as one united force, one vision, one ruler under the eternal blue sky. But empires don't run on vision alone. They run on loyalty, bloodlines, schedules, communication. And when you're managing the largest contiguous land empire in history, even the best system starts to shake. The trouble started with succession. After Genghis Khan died, his son Gedai took over. Then came Kublai, Mondi, and a host of other descendants. And while they were all technically part of the same bloodline, unity didn't last. Ambition and geography pulled them apart. So the empire fractured. It split into four major khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai Khan, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in the northwest, covering parts of Russia and Eastern Europe, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle. East on paper, they all served the Great Khan. In reality, they were independent powers, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, and always watching their backs. Each Khanate had its own problems. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1330s after a series of weak rulers and economic disasters. The Golden Horde fractured into smaller hordes, with rival clans tearing at each other like wolves. The Chagatai Khanate degenerated into civil wars and lost legitimacy. And the Yuan dynasty? It survived the longest, but even it fell by 1368 when the Chinese Ming dynasty rose in rebellion and kicked them out. Corruption played its part. As the empire expanded, so did its bureaucracy. Bribes, inflated taxes, and nepotism ran rampant. Mongol governors, once feared for their discipline, became indistinguishable from the tyrants they had replaced. Then came the plague. The Black Death ripped through the empire like a second conquest. Trade routes that once carried silk and silver now carried disease. Entire towns were emptied. Farmers vanished. Fortresses became ghost towns. The administrative machine choked on its own silence. And underneath it all, resentment. The conquered never forgot. In China, Persians, Arabs, and Slavs, people who had bowed under the Mongol yoke for generations, began to rise up. Small rebellions turned into movements. Movements turned into revolutions. But the scariest cracks came from within. Mongol nobles fought among themselves. Generals betrayed khans. Successors were poisoned, strangled, or left to rot in exile. The very loyalty that had built the empire now ate away at it like acid. Even their greatest strength, their ability to adapt, became a weakness. In Persia, Mongol rulers converted to Islam and blended into local culture. In China, the Yuan emperors adopted Confucian rituals. In Russia, they grew dependent on tribute from princes who learned to manipulate them. And so, the empire dissolved. Not in fire, but in silence. Cities once under Mongol command began issuing their own laws. Regional warlords took over. Trade slowed. Roads decayed. The couriers stopped coming. By the 15th century, what was left? A memory, a warning. 1,000 broken helmets buried under sand and snow. But even in their downfall, the Mongols left fingerprints. Later empires, Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, even the Russian Tsars, borrowed from Mongol systems. From administration to military structure, the echo of the horde rolled on. And in that echo, some heard more than history. They heard hoofbeats. Because long after the empire died, the world feared it might rise again. The Mongols were gone, but their shadow never really left. Even centuries after the last Khan faded from power, the memory of their invasions clung to the world like smoke that never fully clears. Not just as stories, but as warnings. In Eastern Europe, mothers whispered Mongol tales to their children. Like modern boogeymen, stay quiet, don't wander. The Tatars will take you. Tatars, what many Europeans called the Mongols, and their successors, became a synonym for terror, for chaos, for the sound of hooves in the dark. In Russia, the legacy was even deeper. The Golden Horde had ruled for over 2 centuries. When it collapsed, its blueprint remained. Moscow adopted it. The Russian Tsars took the Mongol model of centralized authority, tribute collection, and absolute rule, and made it their own. Even the terrible didn't just expand his territory. He built his authority on fear, obedience, and cavalry, just like the Khans had taught. The same happened in India. When Babur, a descendant of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, founded the Mughal Empire, he didn't just inherit a bloodline. He inherited a method. Fast-moving armies, religious tolerance as policy, and brutal retribution for rebellion. The Mughals ruled through a system that echoed Mongol discipline and Mongol ambition, even if their cities were full of domes and gardens instead of yurts. Even the Ottomans borrowed from them. Their elite cavalry corps, their census practices, their postal relays, these weren't original innovations. They were adapted from the Mongol playbook. And in the West, the fear lingered. For centuries, European historians viewed the Mongol invasions as divine punishment. Some saw them as antichrists, army. Others as the scourge of God, a force so terrible it could only have been sent from the heavens to humble mankind. And that fear shaped policy. European kingdoms built stronger fortifications, developed better intelligence networks, created faster communication systems, all in case the Mongols ever returned. The papacy even tried to convert them. If they couldn't be defeated, perhaps they could be recruited. It didn't work, but the effort alone shows how much of a threat they remained, even in absence. And sometimes, the threat wasn't just psychological. Because Mongol successor states kept causing trouble long after the empire itself dissolved. The Crimean Khanate, for example, launched slave raids into Eastern Europe for centuries, raids that echoed the old patterns of Mongol warfare. Fast, ruthless, devastating. Entire villages in Ukraine and Poland lived with the constant fear of abduction. Even in the 1600s, the ghosts never stopped riding. In Asia, nomadic confederations like the Oirat, and later the Dzungars, tried to reassemble fragments of the old empire. Their rise sparked new conflicts, new campaigns, each one a flicker of the Mongol storm returning. Even in Mongolia itself, long after the empire's collapse, the people remembered. The name Genghis Khan was never forgotten. His burial site became sacred. His laws were copied into new codes. His ideals were folded into Mongolian nationalism. And in the 20th century, as Mongolia sought to define itself amid foreign pressures, the ghost of the Khan became a flag. But ghosts don't build empires. They haunt them. They whisper to the ambitious, to the desperate, to the brutal. They say, ride hard, rule harder. Let the world burn if it must. That's the price of ice, greatness, and some listen. The legacy of the Mongols wasn't just in the laws they left behind. It was in the fear they carved into the earth, in the idea that one day the world might tremble again beneath the hooves of riders from the steppe. And that fear wasn't superstition, it was memory. But empires, no matter how vast, carry a curse. And that curse doesn't just haunt the conquered. It haunts the conquerors too. To conquer the world is one thing. To live with what you've done, that's something else. The Mongols were never sentimental. They didn't write epic poems about their victims. They didn't carve names into marble or compose elegies for fallen cities. They wrote, they ruled, they erased. But conquest leaves residue even on the ones doing the conquering. You don't kill millions, raise libraries, enslave whole populations, and then go home unchanged. Not even if you think you're chosen by the eternal blue sky. That's the part of the story no one talks about. The toll on the conquerors. Mongol generals lived hard and died harder. Many were never home again after their first campaign. Their lives became a blur of orders, marches, battles, and funerals. Some died in far-off jungles. Others were executed by their own men. A few simply disappeared into the territories they had helped destroy, too injured, too broken, or too disillusioned to return. Even the royal bloodline wasn't spared. Genghis Khan's descendants spent more time killing each other than ruling. Cousins poisoned cousins. Brothers went to war. Sons betrayed fathers. The same force that had united the world shattered their own house. And then there were the soldiers, the ones who survived the marshes, who didn't freeze in Russia or drown in the typhoon on the way to Japan. Many of them returned not to parades, but to silence. Villages gone, families moved. The world changed behind their backs. They had become instruments, tools, and when the war was over, there wasn't much left for them except more war or oblivion. Others turned inward. Some Mongols became drunk on their own power. They demanded tribute where none was owed. Used fear as currency. These weren't warriors anymore. They were landlords in stolen lands, hollowed out by years of blood and marching. And their legacy? Complex. Genghis Khan is revered in Mongolia, his image etched into national identity. Statues rise. Airports bear his name. He's seen as the father of a people, a lawgiver, a unifier. But to the people in Baghdad, in Kiev, in Nishapur, he's a shadow, a curse, a whisper passed down from grandmother to grandchild. This is what happens when the sky gets angry. The Mongol Empire gave the world new systems, roads, commerce, connections. It spread ideas, languages, religion. It shrunk the world into something more navigable, but it also salted the soil, flattened cities, and taught humanity that peace can be as fragile as paper, and civilization, no matter how old, can be wiped, clean in a matter of days. And for those who lived through it, they didn't tell stories about glory. They told stories about the day the horizon filled with hooves, the day the sky darkened, the day everything changed, because that's the final truth. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, warrior or monk, child or king. If you were alive during the Mongol invasions, you were vulnerable. So, what does it mean to live through a storm like that? To survive an invasion not just of armies, but of ideas of systems, silence, and stories that rewrite the world around you? It means waking up one day and realizing the future you thought you were building is gone. That the people who were supposed to protect you are dead. That your gods, your kings, your books, none of them mattered in the end. Because the Mongol invasions didn't just conquer land, they conquered certainty. And that's the part that lingers. Long after the fires died and the hooves moved on, people still lived in the ruins. They rebuilt over bones. They spoke in borrowed languages. They sang songs with missing verses. They clung to what little memory hadn't been drowned in fear. The Mongol Empire is gone now, but its impact isn't. You see it in the way empires organize their armies, in the way states control trade, in the paranoia of kings and the precision of generals. You see it in roadmaps, in currency systems, in diplomatic playbooks. You even see it in the way history tells stories, how it remembers the victors and forgets the victims. And maybe that's why it's worth remembering. Not the glory, but the cost. The people who had to live through it, who didn't ride or rule or win, but endured. The bakers, the mothers, the scribes, the children, the ones history almost forgot. So tonight, when you think about the Mongols, don't just picture warriors on horseback. Picture the silence after they've gone, and the quiet breath of someone still alive, whispering to the next generation, "This is what happened. Remember."